Test. This is Chalmers Carr, birth date August 29th, 1937. He served in Vietnam and Southeast Asia. He achieved the rank of Brigadier General. We are recording this on Friday, October 26, 2012. I am Schuyler, Easterling, and I'm conducting the interview, no relation. Okay, General Carr, get started, a little bit of background on you. Where were you born, and tell me a little bit about your childhood.
I was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1937. My father was a young naval doctor at the time, graduating from Jefferson Medical School, and was assigned to the Philadelphia Naval Yard at that time. My childhood was primarily associated with moves, associated with his military career, to include, he was in the Pacific at the time that Pearl Harbor was bombed, and we were back living in Mooresville, and our other hometown, North Carolina, was where my mother was from, was Bass, North Carolina. It was down near Pinehurst in the Sandhills. And we lived there, but when my dad would come back from sea, I made my first trip across the United States with my mother and my young brother in early 1942, because my dad's ship had returned to San Francisco after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Then, of course, he was either assigned on the East Coast or the West Coast, but basically different sea duties back and forth. And then after the war, I happened to live in Annapolis 3 different times since he was assigned as a medical officer in Annapolis. Then he basically, we lived in North Carolina once. He ended up out in Oakland as the chief of orthopedics for the Oakland Naval Hospital there. And his last assignment was at the Bethesda Naval Medical Center, which is now Walter Reed, as the chief of orthopedics at that time. He left the military in 1955 and assumed into private practice in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I have been going to different schools and ended up going to a prep school up in North Carolina called Christ School for Boys, of which I graduated from and came to Clemson, basically, while we were living in Charlotte, although I had not lived there very much. And when I arrived at Clemson, I wasn't going to come to Clemson. It's an interesting part I always tell people. Growing up in the military, I wasn't going to have anything to do with the military. But lo and behold, I had an uncle who graduated in the class in 1924, who was at the time an Army colonel, and he kept talking to me about Clemson. And he called me when I was up at this prep school and said, you need to go down and look at Clemson. I said, Uncle Slick, not interested. They've dropped the military. Well, I got on a bus and came down here and arrived on a beautiful spring day. I believe it was late April or May. His nephew met me, showed me around the campus. I was taken down to the Goat McMillan, who was the freshman football coach, and I was invited to come on as a walk-on. The neat thing about that was I left there on Sunday on a bus with all my paperwork filled out for admissions. All I had to do was take it back to Christ School, get them to sign it, send it in, and I was accepted. There wasn't the long process that it goes through right now. Well, I came to Clemson and arrived in early August back then at football camp. As a freshman, we had freshman football at the time. Got my head shaved, got a beanie that we had to wear in those days, and went to football practice. And then one day after practice, we came up and they said, well, we got to go matriculate for classes. Well, back in those days, you went down to one of the gyms at Fike, not the little gym, and they had tables set up, and you had to go around and get your little punch cards. They didn't have computers, everything was just starting. And I filled out, and basically all your classes were core classes. I arrived here going to study agricultural engineering, and went around and got all my classes and got done, and I went back to my advisor table, and he said, you're not done. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, you don't have ROTC. And I said, I thought they dropped the military. And he said, no, they dropped the military corps, but ROTC is mandatory for everybody for 2 years. So I turned around and there was a blue line and a green line, and I was smart enough to know that I wasn't going to get in the green line, so I got in the blue line. And basically, the rest is sort of history. Got into ROTC. They came to me my junior year and said, we think you would make make a good pilot if you pass the physical? Would you be interested? And I said yes, and I passed the physical and became a full-time ROTC student, basically. And then had a wonderful time here at Clemson. Like you, I played freshman ball. I was sort of a Monday through Thursday player, what we call bohunks. And I left the football program in early 59 to become Bill Wilhelm's second baseball manager. Was able to go to the College World Series and stayed with that till I graduated. I worked at the athletic department. I lived up in the top of Fife, which was a dormitory for visiting teams, and part of my job was to make sure those rooms were all made up and everything else for visiting teams like basketball, baseball, tennis, those smaller teams, Olympic sport teams as we now call them. Back to my childhood, we moved in a lot of different locations. Basically, it was either on the West Coast or the East Coast. Went to a lot of different schools. I think it was a rewarding experience as you look back on it, a diversified experience. I know that when I came to Clemson, you got to remember Clemson was still a very small school, 3,500 boys. We were just beginning to minister girls. But to be honest about it, very, very narrow-minded. There was still integration in the South. I had been exposed to integration, had an open mind on diversity, and was somewhat appalled at some of the reactions of some of my fellow Clemson students. And I don't need to go into the slang words and all the different words that were used to describe the feelings of the whites versus the blacks in the South at the time. So, but I overall said that my military background, or military experience as a youth, was a broadening experience, and I think it helped formulate my life later on. So that kind of brings you through, unless you got any specifics about my early childhood.
No, sir, that sets up perfectly. I was wondering if you had known from an early age, you know, that the military might have been a possible career, but you've mentioned no, not at all.
Had no idea about it. It was very, very strange, the fact that Clemson introduced me to flying, and I fell in love with flying. And we can go from there.
So you at no particular time you decided the Air Force because that was what you enjoyed doing when you had the ROTC training?
Basically, yes.
Okay. So when did you graduate from Clemson? What year?
1960.
1960, okay.
And at the time, I had a pilot training date of March of 1961. Because of my grades, to maintain my grades and such, I had to go to summer camp to get commissioned. So I graduated from Clemson, stood on the commissioning ceremony, but did not receive the commissioning oath. I had to leave Clemson, went to Selma, Alabama, which was Craig Air Force Base at the time, and went through summer camp and received my commission at summer camp. I returned back to Charlotte, and of course I couldn't find a job. But at the time in the South, the funeral homes ran the ambulance services. But Charlotte was becoming such a city at the time, even though small, that they had decided that they needed an ambulance service. My father, being a medical doctor, was part of a board that was put together, and they had hired a franchise to come in and set up an ambulance service. And he got me a job with them, and it was sort of the forerunner to the EMSs. We had to go through X number of hours of medical training with these doctors and learn the basic Red Cross and how to deliver babies and how to set splints and things like that. So I drove an ambulance from, I think it was late July of 60 until I left for pilot training in March of 61. And it was during this period of time that ambulance drivers, of course, always end up in emergency rooms and such, and that's where I met my wife. And we later got married after I finished pilot training through working there.
So she followed you when you did join the Air Force. Did she follow? I guess she came.
No, I left, and like I said, and went out to Williams Air Force Base, Chandler, Arizona, all the way across the United States. Drove out there, and you got to remember there's no interstate highways or anything like that. And entered pilot training in March of 1962. Graduated, 1961, graduated in March of 1962. And 7 days after I graduated, I came back to Charlotte, and we got married on the 7th of April of 1962. We just celebrated 50 years this past April. And then she followed me. We left there. I went back to Williams as an instructor pilot. And I stayed there 5 years, and then basically had my first tour in Southeast Asia, but it was a training tour. I was sent to Southeast Asia, to Karat Air Force Base, Thailand, to advise the Thai Flying School, which was stationed there along on one side of the field. On the other side of the field, we were flying F-105s going north into Vietnam, or into North Vietnam. And I spent two years there on a mag tour, and I left there and came back and was assigned to an exchange tour with the U.S. Navy in their training program. And I spent 2.5 years with the Navy at Meridian, Mississippi, and then was assigned to go to F4 training, which I went through a very rushed course, which they were setting up. They really needed to get pilots back over to Southeast Asia, and they were running some experimental classes of bringing people that had not come up through the fighter ranks, and gave us a 6-month checkout course in the F4, and I went back to Udon, Thailand, and flew a year of combat in the F4 at the 432nd Tactical Fighter Wing, and then what they call the Triple Nickel, the 555th Fighter Squadron, which ended up being the fighter squadron that shot down the most MiGs throughout the Vietnam War. I left Thailand and came back to Columbus, Mississippi in the Air Force Training Command. Stayed there 2 years and then was assigned to the Pentagon, where I stayed 5 years. And basically, when I went to the Pentagon, I'd been flying airplanes for straight line pilot for about 15 years, 13, 14 years. And that, in essence, ended my operational flying tour. I spent 5 years in the Pentagon and then went to War College in Australia, then got a command assignment at a remote assignment in Alaska. Left there and went back to the training command. Now I'm a colonel, and went through as a deputy commander of maintenance, and then the deputy commander for base operations, and then I was assigned as a commander at one of our tech training centers up in Texas. And then I left there, and now we're up into 1988, 89, 86, I'm sorry. I went out as the director of inspection for the Air Force inspection, Air Force IG, running all their inspection programs, and we were based at Norton Air Force Base, California. Spent a little over 2 years there, and then my last assignment was back to the Air Force Training Command in San Antonio, where I was the Inspector General for what they called the Air Training Command. It's now called the Air Education and Training Command. And I retired there in exactly 30 years in 1991.
So you obviously saw, some big changes from when you first entered the military and when you left. What were some of the biggest changes you saw during that time within the Air Force?
Well, the biggest change was the people. When I entered the Air Force, remember, we still had a draft going on, and of course, as a pilot, you didn't have a whole lot of association with the enlisted folks. They strapped me in the airplane, they fixed my airplane, I got out of it, I wrote it up, and went about my business. But it was where you really got close to them was during that tour, a combat tour, because we worked very, very closely together, and we were beginning to get into the all-volunteer force. And the all-volunteer force was good for the military as far as I'm concerned, it has proved that way. So by the time I came out of the Pentagon and now became commander at different levels, squadron level and such, we were dealing with a force that was motivated, it was educated. 98% of your enlisted force was high school graduates now. You didn't have the disciplinary problems that you had with the draft force. So I have to say, and I think it ranks still today, that what makes our military so great today is the people. And it is an all-volunteer force, and they're there because they want to be there. And I have to say, discounting all the technological changes, discounting the advent of computers and all of that, it's the people that made the most dramatic changes and allowed us to have a very effective but yet the best fighting force in the world, and it still remains that so, even with budget cuts and everything.
And so your combat primarily consisted of Vietnam.
Right.
And what were the conditions like in Vietnam at the time? What was the morale when you entered?
Well, I got over there, and I'm going to get my dates mixed up. I believe I got over there in March of 70, into Udon, Thailand, which was one of the 4 bases that we were flying out of Thailand, supporting either operations in what we call the Laos, southern part of Laos, and into Vietnam. And we were the northernmost base, north, but we were in a bombing lull. We were in a period of time where we were not going up north. In fact, we weren't even going into southern North Vietnam at the time. There was a bombing halt, so to speak. So our flying was sporadic for about the first 8 months. We were doing support missions in support of the Laotian Army in Laos and in support of the South Vietnam armies and our own forces in the what I call the northern part of South Vietnam. That's as far down we'd go, and there were code names for those places. So our missions were primarily consisted of air-to-ground support missions, interdiction of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, interdicting supplies south. Occasionally we would work with the what we call the Raven Fax, which was at the time was a clandestine backed Air America thing that was in support of the Laotian army forces that were fighting the North Vietnamese and also the rebels in Laos. Or we were in direct support of our own American forces, primarily in the northern part of South Vietnam, in and around Da Nang, in that area. Our other missions consisted of going up and flying what we'd call mid-cap. We'd put ourselves between the potential threat of North Vietnam and B-52 bombers, which were coming primarily out of Utapao, southern Thailand, and doing bombing raids in those same areas. Or occasionally we would fly what we call mid-cap for reconnaissance aircraft, U-2s and SR-71s that were making reconnaissance flights up over North Vietnam and in those areas also. As I mentioned, it was slow. You'd fly once or twice a week, so morale was high, but yet there was a lot of boredom, a lot of busy work around the squadron and things like this. However, right after the first of the year, things began to pick up. The North Vietnamese Air Force was getting more aggressive. They were trying to make more attacks on our gunships at night, trying to fit operations. And it was there where we started doing a lot more night support missions. And consequently, I think I ended up with about 135 total combat missions, give or take a few. And I want to say less than a dozen that actually went into North Vietnam, and all of those North Vietnam missions were primarily in the latter part of that operation where we were escorting our recce birds. The 432nd Attack Fighter Wing was the one unique wing in the Air Force where we had both fighters and recces, both F-4s, at the same base, and we flew in conjunction with each other. And so when the recce pilots would go on a mission, either 1 or 2 recce birds, there would be 2 or 4 of us go along with them to suppress any fire that they would get both in their ingress and egress routes. And so the bulk of my flying in Southeast Asia took place after the first of the year. It may have been as early as late December. But again, the missions didn't change very much. We were primarily involved in air-to-ground or mid-cap type missions.
Were you ever scared about a lot of was it just, I mean, I didn't know.
No, I read through those questions. I think there was 2 missions late in the period where in North Vietnam, where I had the opportunity or misfortune of having a SAM fired at me, but it was not a threat. We saw it and took evasive action early on. Nothing like the pilots going up into the Red River Valley and up into Route Pack 6 and up into Hanoi at time. We were not going up there yet. And like I said, primarily our missions were flying. And at the time, which later became true, it was pretty evident that the North Vietnamese were building up their stockpiles of forces in North Vietnam, which later proved to be true and later proved to be the offense that they were able to push south after we had pulled out of South Vietnam. But that buildup started long before that came about.
So you mentioned that when you weren't flying, you was filled with a lot of boredom. How did you fill the time on the base? What did you do, and a little bit about your friends that you had on base?
Well, we played a lot of handball, basketball. We had things to do around the squadron. I also, about halfway through my tour, maybe even sooner than that, became a command post controller. And the command post, of course, was operating 24 hours a day where we were controlling all our airplanes, coordinating. And I can't remember when it was I became the head of the command post. People left. So that occupied a lot of my time because now I'm in charge of running. Before that, when I was a controller, we'd be working 10 or 12-hour shifts, 12 on, 12 off, and then I'd intermix my flying. But when I became the commander of the command post, now I had a full-time job because I had a whole, also other pilots that were working for me on their schedules, and then I had some enlisted folks that also rotated through there that did and I won't get into the specifics of operating the command post. We operated right in the wing headquarters. We had what we call the frag shop. That was the shop that took all the orders of battle from the headquarters and divvied them up and decided what bomb loads were on them and how the schedule was run to meet the targets that we had to meet. And so that really occupied a lot of my time the last 6 to 8 months that I was over there. It became a full-time job.
So when you left Vietnam and you came back to the United States, I know you hadn't seen your wife in a long time. Did you have children at the time as well, or?
Yes, we did. We had 2. In fact, as I mentioned, my daughter was born while we were on that first assignment out in Arizona. But my son was actually born in Thailand because I was on a 2-year tour. My wife and daughter were able to join me because I was on what they call a MAC-type tour. I was assigned to the Military Assistance Command, and because I was going to be there for 2 years, they allowed her to come over, and we lived up country in Karat, and normal things happened that I think within 10 months of her arrival, my son was born. And so that was the first time. But then when I was in Thailand on the combat tour, my family came back to Charlotte, where my mom and dad lived, and Jeanette was from Ellerby, which was down near Pinehurst, North Carolina. And they lived in an apartment in Charlotte. And it was unique back in those days because today the soldiers talk on Skype and they talk on cell phone. The only way we talked was letters that usually we'd have to put numbers on all the letters because sometimes they pass back and forth and get crossed. And she had a tape recorder and would put the tape recorder and tape cassettes, old little cassette tapes, on the kitchen table so the kids could talk to me and such as that. And our son was still quite young. He was born in 67, and this was 71. So, and the only time I got back in that year is my wife was able to meet me for a 5-day R&R in the middle of my tour in Hawaii. So I had not seen my children for a year. And so that's how we communicated. We look forward to letters and packages.
Do you still have the cassettes and the letters?
I may have upstairs. There's a lot of stuff that I may have up there, and I don't know how I want to just travel around. It's a bit heated. I haven't even tried to listen to them or such, but I do have a lot of pictures and what do you want to call it? But the big thing back in those days was slides. You didn't take a lot of photographs. You took slides. It was easier to send a roll of film home and they could take them off and show them and that type of thing. It wasn't like digital cameras or anything like that.
So when you came back from Vietnam, how were you received? Did you suffer from any of the wrongful public opinion at the time?
Very, very little. Of course, at the time we were instructed not to wear our uniforms once we got back to the States. So we traveled in civilian clothes. We were instructed not to make a big deal out of it. I came back, trying to think how I came back. I came back by military transport to Travis, Air Force Base, California. And immediately, then we traveled in uniform. Immediately, I think whatever it was, took a shower, you know, had been traveling, changed into civilian clothes, rode a bus or something to San Francisco International and flew nonstop to Atlanta or Dallas into Charlotte. And so it's a very quick trip. Didn't have, but after I got back, and of course I left there and went to Columbus, Mississippi, and the attitude of the Air Force had changed. I had gotten to Columbus and we were dealing with drug problems. We were dealing with, we were having to work hard, and that was the time where there was a lot of protests going on in the United States. But personally, no. A lot of stories about it and everything else. And I left the Pentagon. I left there and went to the Pentagon. And when I got to the Pentagon, we were only allowed to wear our uniform one day a week. Again, that whole attitude of not allowing the military to be visible and such. And it was about a year and a half after I got there that I actually got turned around and we started wearing our uniforms every day of the week to work in the Pentagon. Of course, the people were riding the metro, they were riding buses and everything else. But personally, no. Read a lot of the stories, talked to some people that had been confounded with it, ran into a lot of, later on in my career, as I said, I got to be a commander and I had some senior NCOs and such. But the Air Force, in a way, was shielded from that type of stuff, unlike the Marine Corps or the Army. I would have to say that in many cases, the Air Force and even the Navy, perhaps, was, I won't say immune to it, but was not exposed to it, like the young men and women that had been in the Army and the Marine Corps.
So when you came back to the United States, what was the biggest thing that you'd seen change in the country when you left? Was it very noticeable, or did it feel like you were back home and everything was great, or what were your feelings?
Well, two things, and it's similar to what we're going through today, except I want to say that I think history's proven that the 60s was probably one of the most turbulent times of this country. There were probably obviously other turbulent times, the Civil War, except now we're moving into the technology age. There's more visible ways of expressing your displeasure. In my age of 75, in fact, at a coffee group, we were talking that this country is divided. No matter who wins this election, it's going to be divided. Are we ever going to be able to go back to where we were a country that pulled together? No. Vietnam, of course, got rid of the draft, brought on the All-Volunteer Force, which again reduced those people that are exposed to the military. The All-Volunteer Force, you had people that didn't want to be there to start with, didn't support the war, and then you've moved into the volunteer force. And we were talking this morning, and I made the statement that we've had two great attacks along this country. One was a unifying attack, Pearl Harbor, everybody was involved, food stamps, rationing, and everything else. We've had 9/11. Other than the initial reaction to 9/11, those that have only been involved in it are those that have people that are directly involved in fighting the war or supporting the war. The rest of the country's gone about doing their own thing. Nobody has suffered from it other than maybe some high taxes or high prices or those type of things. There's not a feeling that the country is at war. And consequently, those that have military experience are dwindling in our elected officials. We've got less than 1% of the American population today that is involved in the military in one form or another. So consequently, I think the mood of the country, being decisive it is there may be some attacks, but I personally feel that they will be short-lived to unify the country. Then the country will go right back to doing what they. So I think when I came back, not realizing it, but I began to see the beginning of that divide in the country.
Did you ever feel like the military was unappreciated?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. The latter part of the 60s, early 70s, I was very, very fortunate. Well, fortunate and unfortunate. When I first got to the Pentagon, right after I got there, I was working down in the basement of the Pentagon in the Airforce Operations Center, and I became first what we call a member of the Air Force briefing team. They're the ones that ran all over the building, briefing all the general officers on the operations of the day and things like this. Then I became the chief of that team. That was the year that Carter got elected, and they brought in a transition team, as they always did, and the young men and women that were part of that transition team let it be known that they were there to downsize the military. They had no appreciation for it. Any budgets were dead on arrival, etc. And so consequently, the mood of the country was shifting away from, like we've done in previous wars too, we didn't need the military. We weren't going to fight any more wars. Well, that proved to be wrong because of Desert One and our Iranian fiasco. And I was privileged enough to come in right behind that under the Reagan years. And Senator Sam Nunn from Georgia led the fight, really, and he was a Democrat, to saying our military needs to be rebuilt. We are not in good shape. And consequently, there was a resurgence. And there was changes in the Pentagon, of which I happened to be part of, and finally became a general officer of a young group of young colonels at the time that became general officers. They were colonels when I was in Vietnam, and they changed the attitude of the Air Force. Likewise, there were changes in the leadership of the Army and the Navy, and we were dealing with increased budgets. We started bringing airplanes on like the F-15, the F-16. We were bringing on Aegis class cruisers, more submarines, more carrier battle groups. The Army was getting the Abrams tank, and we were moving full force into the volunteer force. So yes, there was a decisive low in the late 60s and early 70s of where there was strong press opinion against the military, and why do we need a military? And I'm for one, and feel that we always need a strong military, because we can have poverty, we can have sickness, but the one thing we can't stand is our loss of freedoms. And the only ones that are going to support that or make that survive is a strong, like the president, Romney said the other day, a strong economic country with a strong military, because it's a dangerous world out there, and we can wish it away, but I'm afraid it's not going to go away. Now we're getting into politics.
I know, that's a risky area, but I was going to ask you this too. Throughout your service in the Air Force, you were right smack dab in the middle of the Cold War.
Yes.
What were your feelings? Did you feel like a war with Russia could happen? A full out in the open war could happen? How were you prepared?
Well, you just got to remember the timing. Right after I became a pilot, we went through the Cuban Missile Crisis. And of course, you know the story of Rudolph Anderson, who was a Clemson graduate. And I later was stationed at Laughlin Air Force Base, which was the base where he was assigned. He didn't fly out of there, but the U-2s were a very secret operation out of Laughlin Air Force Base, which Laughlin is due west of San Antonio, Texas, as far as you can go, right against the Mexican border in a town called Del Rio. So that was a rude awakening. That even though I'm an instructor pilot, we knew that forces were moved. We had some pilots that were more senior to us that were being pulled out of there to go do support operations and things like that. So right as a young officer, I was confronted with, hey, I'm in this warfighting business, and things could change very quickly. And then, of course, we moved into the Vietnam War, which was an element of the Cold War. It was one of those elements that the Vietnam War was brought about to stop the expansion of communism throughout Southeast Asia and other places in the country, and there was a line drawn in the sand that said you're not going to go any further. Korea being the first one. Then we roll right into Vietnam. But later on, before the wall fell, when I was back at the Pentagon, I had the opportunity to tour some of you, never stationed in Europe, but tour some of Europe, had the opportunity to go into East Germany at the time. And when you moved from East Berlin, it was like going through night and day. You walk through that door right there, and you have modern buildings, modern sidewalks, and modern streets, and you walk through that door, and on the other side of it was poverty, was people that never had any smiles on their faces. They were walking around in fear and all of that. So, and then of course we had the incidences where we'd have an airplane get shot down because it strayed too close to the border or allegedly got close to the border. We had the Gary Powers incident, and there was the constant political back and forth between the leaders of the country. So the Cold War was real. We also had our brethren in B-52s that were flying around the clock. We kept the B-52s in the air. You kept the looking glass command post in the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in case of a nuclear attack. So it was all there, and it permeated throughout the Air Force. And I'm sure it was the same. We had Army troops in Europe right there on alert, getting ready to say they're going to come through the Fulda Gap. That's where they thought if there was a mass attack in Russia, from Russia, that's where it was going to come. So the military was always thinking that tomorrow we can be in a war. The Cuban Missile Crisis came about that quick, and tensions were high.
And you were prepared. You feel you were prepared to.
Yes, but like I said, during that period of time that Carter came in, our readiness level, that's what's happening today. Our readiness levels, you can look at the military and you can have X squadrons of airplanes, so many battle groups, but you really got to look at what is the readiness of that group. What are their manning levels? What are their ability to fight? How many of the training hours have been cut? What are their supplies? What are their in-commission rates on the aircraft? If the aircraft can't fly, you can have 16 airplanes out there, but only 8 of them are flyable. You're not very effective fighting force. And that's where, when you get into budget cuts, the first thing you get to cut is personnel costs and training costs. Those are the two easiest items to cut, and they're the first things on it. Well, those are the first things that destroy your readiness. And so you really got to look. They mentioned the other night that, we got a 226 ship Navy. We're down, I think we're down to 20 some odd fighter wings. The Army's down to so many divisions. Well, that's all well and good if they're all up and ready to fight. But if they're not, then they're going to get there. We got to take time to get there, and it's going to take money, and you don't snap your fingers and do it overnight. So yes, we were ready. What was our readiness levels where they should be? No. We were going, and that's when Senator Sam Nunn came in. It came to light because of Desert One, came to light and said, hey, we got all this force out here, but it's not ready to fight. It can't fight if it had to. And consequently, he was able to push through budgets. Reagan came along and pushed through budget, and we started improving our readiness. But it took a good 7, 8, 9 years to get us back to the levels that we needed to be. And then, of course, we got involved in the Iraqi war and the war in Afghanistan, and of course there has been a steady decline because of resources. So
piggybacking off that, what were some of your biggest challenges with, you had a very, very high rank in the Air Force. As a Brigadier General, what were some of your biggest challenges during your time?
Well, the jobs that I was in, of course, when I really, like I said, when I left the Pentagon and went to War College, came out of there, and I took over as a commander of a small remote base up in Alaska, out from Anchorage, where we had F-4s on alert to intercept bear bombers. The biggest challenge there was keeping 250 mainly enlisted folks focused on their job, that we had to go to war. And it came to light one sunny afternoon, cold, always snow on the ground, and all of a sudden our 4 F-4s had to launch, and they ran out there, and they came back, and I don't have it with me now, but I was presented when I left there a picture of 2 of my F-4s sitting on the wing of a bear bomber, and that's what we were there for, to do that. And that's, you had to keep those folks focused, and that was during the Cold War. Now we're talking, that was during the Cold War. The bears would come over from Russia, and they would try to penetrate and see what they could do, and we had to let them know that there's a line out there and you don't cross it. So the challenge was to keep those people motivated and focused on their mission. I left there, and I know one of your questions where I was unprepared. I left there and I was assigned as a colonel as the head of 1,000 main aircraft maintenance outfit in Del Rio, Texas. Well, like I told you, up until that time, I didn't know squat all about aircraft maintenance. As far as I was concerned, the aircraft maintenance presented me my airplane, strapped me in it, helped me start it. I got out of it, turned it back to them, and that was it. Well, you learn very quickly that when you got 1,000 men and women, all enlisted force, trying to keep 200 airplanes flying, that you had to learn very quickly. And I wasn't about ready to go learn how to turn a wrench or know how to take an electronic unit apart. So I had to, figure out how am I going to learn this. In addition to that, the outfit was on its butt. And right after I got there, we had an ORI inspection, and we basically failed it. So again, it was a challenge to find the right folks in the organization, the senior NCOs and such, and reorient them to get out and become teachers and leaders and get out from behind desks and turn that outfit around, which we did. So that was a challenge. And I would say, and I've said this before, that most of my career as a commander was as a fireman. The outfit I took over at King Salmon, the commander before me had gotten fired. And the other commander out there had gotten fired. So you went in and took over an organization that was low morale, and there was a lot of things going on that you had to correct. You go into the maintenance outfit, and you had to turn that outfit around, figure out how to meet the challenges to make it a war-fighting effective unit. And I left that, and the next assignment, I actually became the base commander, was probably one of my more enjoyable assignments, because the biggest challenge there was, as a base commander or an air base support group commander, you had everything from the firemen, the cooks, the people that run the MWR programs, which is the recreation, like rec center, flight rec center and such as that, was trying to convince those young men and women how they fit into the picture. That a maintainer knows how he fits in the picture. He's got to maintain that airplane so the pilot can go fly it. But you got to take all these other people and convince them that what they're doing is important to getting that job done. When that pilot, and I've told this story before, that if I was on a combat mission and I got over the target and punched the pickle button and the bombs didn't go off, there's not a damn thing I can do about it. Somebody in that chain has let me down. All I can do is light the afterburners, turn around and get the hell out of there. If you roll in behind a MiG or an enemy aircraft and you go to fire the missiles and the missiles don't come off, there's not a damn thing you can do about it. Somebody in the system has let you down. And that goes all the way back to the maintainer, but somebody has to feed the maintainer, somebody has to bathe the maintainer, provide recreation for him. So it's a complete network, and I would have to say that that's what I did. I left Del Rio and went up to take over a tech training center that was going to be closed, and they decided to keep it open. So I had the challenge of reorienting the people and planning and keeping that organization open. It again had come very close to failing its ORIs. And spent a year and a half there, and when we left there, we got one of the highest OR rates that had ever been given to a tech training center. So the biggest challenge was motivating and leading people. Was the biggest challenge I would say that I've faced. And I think most general officers will tell you that. It's people. That's what the military is. It's all people.
And how was the experience different from when you first joined to then having that?
When I first joined, all I wanted to do was fly airplanes. Put me in an airplane, let me fly. When I got out to Willie, we were flying around the clock. We were supposed to be flying no more than 40 hours a month, or 40 hours a week. I think it was 100 hours a month. I was logging 140, 150, 160 hours a month, flying almost 7 days a week. That didn't stop in the flying game until the least amount of flying that I did was when I was in combat. In the training command, you flew around the clock. They're pilots today, other than combat pilots, our tanker pilots, our cargo pilots are flying around the clock today. They've been doing that for 15 years. So, but a pilot wants to fly. He wants to fly. He doesn't want to be sitting around. Thought it was, great. I'm doing what I want to do. So, and that's what I did for almost 13 years. Do nothing but fly airplanes.
So what aircraft do you primarily fly there?
Primarily trainers. I started out in the T-37 and the T-38, the T-33, and that's what I did on my first tour in Thailand, with training the Thai pilots how to fly, set up a flying school for them. They had 37s and T-33s. Came back, went to the Navy in their training program, instructing Navy and Marine pilots how to fly in Meridian, Mississippi, and they're the T-2 aircraft. And then, of course, Airforce, and then back to our training command. And it was the culture of the Air Force at the time that during the Vietnam War and such, your losing command had first choice on you coming back. So it was hard to go fight the war where you belonged to the Pacific Air Forces and the Tactical Air Command to come back. They had first choice on it, and they needed experience. So consequently, that's where I came back to. And most of my command assignments, the one where I made general officer was at Del Rio, was in the training command. So primarily I was associated with the training command. Later, as the director of inspection, I was able to fly just about every airplane we had in the Air Force, as long as it had 2 seats in it, because if you were not fully qualified in the airplane, they always put an instructor pilot in the back seat with you. So, but nevertheless, I got to fly the F-15, the F-16. Couldn't fly the A-10 because it's only a single seat version. Flew the F-111, flew the B-52, never flew the B-2 or the B-1. But no, in fact, when I got in the Air Force, it was sort of like, if I can fly airplanes, and spend 20 years and walk out of here as a major or a lieutenant colonel, and that was the promotion rates at the time. That's all you wanted to do. And then the promotion rates changed, and it was when I was, I won't call it a sponsor, but I worked for a colonel in the 432nd in Thailand, a man by the name of Charlie Gabriel from North Carolina. And he later became he's the one that brought me out of the Pentagon, out of Columbus to the Pentagon when he became a 1-star. And then he rose very quickly and later became a 3-star and went to Korea. And then he was assigned back as the Pentagon, and I was working up in the 3-star's office, and he called me and said, I want you to stay there with me. He later became Chief of Staff of the Air Force. And that was when we were going through the transition, and I don't need to get into all the details there, but there was a great transition. This was the early part of the Reagan years. And working with people like that, surrounded by good people, aggressive people, that knew that we had to change. We had to make this Air Force ready to take these Reagan dollars and make sure that we were building a force that was ready to do the job. We were building the force that convinced the Russians that it was time to quit and brought the wall down. That was what was going on at the time, and it was great to be a part of that. Absolutely fantastic. All volunteer force, young men and women coming in, charged up, ready. It was a great time to be part of, quote, quote, the leadership of the Air Force at the time.
That's fantastic. You talked about how much you did enjoy the military. I know you made many connections throughout it. Are you able to see a lot of your friends, your closest friends, I'm sure, have probably come from either your military days at Clemson or military days around really the globe? Are you able to get together with them a lot?
No, not really. There were 5 of us that went through pilot training together. We were called a Gang of 5, Gang of 6. And 3 of those are still alive, still live in the Phoenix area. Out of the 5 or 6, every one of them went to, at the time, you got to remember 1960, 65, 66, the airlines were converting to jets. They were hiring pilots like crazy. All of them went with the airlines except me. But yet, and they all became airline captains. One of them died about 20 years ago, but we stayed close in touch. One has gone through some very serious health problems. I am on email with him, talking to him on the telephone. He survived the scare with cancer so far. But other than that, General Gabriel died, ended up having dementia, and died a couple of years ago. Other people, you run into them occasionally, and a lot of them are on an email. I've got a very extensive email list. But to run into them and see them today, one of the things that I really like about moving to Clemson was being able to be associated with people that are in the Clemson Corps, have the similar backgrounds, even though didn't know a damn one of them, other than didn't know Bill Austin till after he got back here. He and I were, he's one class behind me, 59. Bobby Fant and I knew each other, but I didn't realize he'd gone into the Navy until after we got back here, and he was a prisoner of war, and he lives here. But it's that part of it is what makes living here at Clemson so good, with its military background, military traditions, people working together. I can tell you right now that I think President Barker and the rest of the Board of Trustees knows if you want to get something done around this campus, just give it to the Clemson Corps and we'll get it done, right, one way or the other. And we'll do it right. Another example is that just most recent Military Appreciation Day. Fantastic. Gets better every year. John Cicetta and the Clemson Corps and putting all that together is just fantastic. The Scroll of Honor, I mean, that was 10 years. Passion. I spent many, many hours, along with Colonel Danny Rhodes and all the rest of them, working on that project from conception to what you see out there today. And that's taken a mud hole and transformed it into a living memorial and a living teaching moment that's as President Barker said, it's probably one of the most rewarding and meaningful projects that he's been involved in on this campus since then. So to answer your question, I've got a Christmas card list, Christmas letter list that's probably close to 100, which are mainly military people. We exchange Christmas cards. We're on email, but do we get together socially? No.
But you are involved, as you mentioned, with Clemson Corps, so even though you're out of the military now, you're finding ways to still be involved.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, I know you're a busy man with Clemson Corps, and
well, it's winding down a little bit.
A little bit.
I'm letting some of the younger ones.
Y'all put up your feet a little bit.
Yeah, take over.
And I know that you had such a long service history. What was maybe the best part, or some of your best experiences with the military? How did it change your life? I mean, it's changed your life in almost every facet, but how did it impact you?
Well, obviously, I think it made me a better person. It made me a better father, a better husband, a better citizen. It's hard. It's the cumulative effects of 30 years in the military. And again, it goes back to working with the people. And we don't have enough time to go into all the different details of all the little things that you had to face, the challenges you had to face. But they were there on a constant battle. Not so much as a young pilot. We were flying, like I said. It was when you get in, it started getting into when I got to the Pentagon. And again, I still had that attitude. Maybe now I've graduated, make it to lieutenant colonel. Well, then I got to working around people and said, hey, that's a general officer. I can be as good as he is. That's a colonel. I can be as good as he is. And it's the challenges at the Pentagon. It's the challenges of command. It's just a cumulative effect. And I wouldn't change it one bit. Not one bit. I have no regrets. I've been some great places. I've worked for some good people. I've worked for some bad people. People have always asked us, what was your favorite assignment? That lady that just walked in the door, both of us without hesitation will tell you, Laughlin Air Force Base, Del Rio, Texas. And they'll look back and say, what in the heck is Del Rio? You're out in the middle of nowhere. It was the people. We worked hard. You didn't have the outside attractions of having a big town nearby. We played hard. The townsfolk, we made some of our best friends that we still have of the civilians. One of your questions was interacting with the civilians there and up in San Angelo, Texas. Salt of the earth, West Texas people. You can't find them any better. And it's that kind of association that you don't forget. We go back to Del Rio about once every 3 years and spend a couple of days there, and it's just like old home week. Going back, never left. And now that was almost 30 years, 25 years ago.
So if you had, kind of conclude this interview, if you had one thing to say to the young people of this country that I feel it's hard for them to get a grasp on really the impact the military has had. I mean, and I feel a lot of children, young and even in my generation in the college years, they just don't think about it. What would you say to them about military? How should they be aware, and how can they honor the military?
If you've been to the Scroll of Honor, there's a flagpole down there. Freedom is not free. Like I told you earlier in the conversation, we can have the poverty, we can address health care, but if we can't live free, all the rest of it is secondary. And there'll be a lot of discussion over that, whether we should have feeding mouths. But when it comes down to it, freedom is not free. And there's a very, very small portion of the American public that is providing that freedom for us today. Now, whether they support the war in Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam, that's a decision the military doesn't really have a choice to make. But thank goodness we've got those young men and women that have stepped forward when asked, who will we send? Who will I send? Here I am, send me. And all those young men and women ask is to support them. Don't spit on them. Don't boo on them. At the football game last week, when they're taking an oath, and because you're wrapped up in a political campaign, don't send the wrong signal to them, those young men and women. Thank goodness they're there, because if they weren't, we'd be in a world of hurt. And that's the message I have to send. And that's what I think we do here at Clemson. Through the Clemson Corps and our tradition, keeping our tradition alive. I think probably there's a lot of Clemson students that don't even know about our military history, but I will gauge to tell you that if you went to the University of South Carolina, or you went to another public university or something like that, there would even be less that would have an appreciation of what the military does for this country. So, to answer your question, support those young men and women that stepped forward and said, "Here I am, send me."
Well, I agree completely. Well, General, I thank you very much for your time. I thank you for your service, and I appreciate the interview, and of course, very thankful for your dedication to the military.
Well, efforts like yours are going to help us accomplish what we really want to do, and that's educate the public.